When it comes to protecting your credit, there is one document that reigns supreme and in fact is the cornerstone of everything. What's that document, Mel?
It's your terms of trade. Ultimately, everything comes down to the terms of trade that you have in place. Not only the terms of trade that you have, but that you have in place with your customers.
Quick definition there. What's the difference?
Terms of trade might be something that sits in a drawer. It might be on your website somewhere, but you don't necessarily have a link between your relationships with your customers and your terms of trade. You haven't formally given your clients your terms of trade and engaged them through documentation.
Okay, so it's not just about having terms of trade, it's about the process
Correct.
of making sure that it's acknowledged, that it's signed, that all those things. So you've got to have a process in place.
Perfect.
What's in a terms of trade? Why is it so important?
So fundamentally, terms of trade enables you to do so many important things in business. It enables you to do debt collection and to be able to on-charge the costs. So a debt collection company might charge you 25% in order to be able to recover that cost. So if someone owes you $10,000, that's $2,500 that's going to come off your bottom line.
Or added onto. Gotcha.
So that you have the ability to on-charge collection costs. You can on-charge interest. You can on-charge administration fees. You can on-charge a number of different things that you wouldn't be able to do so if you didn't have them in your terms of trade.
Okay. I was actually very pleasantly surprised because I thought this was like a $10,000 document or something. And when you go and actually investigate the costs and things around this, you might be very pleasantly surprised about how reasonable it is for what it does. But how do we put these terms of trade in place? What do we have to do with our customers?
So one of the things that's really important with your terms of trade is to be able to ensure, firstly, that they are written correctly and that they follow key pieces of legislation. And that has to be done right, or it can throw your entire case out if it ever went to court. But the way that you engage your terms of trade with your clients is a number of different ways. Ultimately, signature on paper, whether it's signed through a credit application form or a client information form that relates back to your terms of trade, that's the ultimate form of engagement in your terms of trade. What we do also build into really good terms of trade is something called an acceptance clause, which enables you to say to people, by going ahead and using your services, they're taken to have read and be bound by the terms of trade. A key point with terms of trade is to ensure that you are disclosing your terms of trade. And the disclosure of your terms of trade comes before you start doing any work with your clients. So there are some businesses who may, for example, attach terms of trade to an invoice, which they're sending to customers after the job's been done. However, in order for those terms of trade to be valid, they need to be disclosed up front before you do the job. So
it's not just about having them, it's also how you use them and putting them in place. Now, I know there'll be people out there who'll be sitting there going, I can buy them online. Why can I not get my lawyer to do it? Why can I not buy them online? What's wrong with that?
So in terms of whether or not you would just cobble together your own terms of trade through online is, there's this really, really cheesy example, and it talks about a parachute. Would you build your own parachute from instructions you got on the internet and then jump out of a plane and hope it's going to hold?
I know I wouldn't. I've seen my handyman skills, they're not good.
And this is the thing, with terms of trade, if you've got holes in your documentation, if the legislation in your documentation is old or out of date or irrelevant, then that can really have a negative effect on how well you can enforce those terms of trade. So working with a company that specialises in terms of trade as part of best practice credit management and debt prevention is going to make sure that you've got the very best terms of trade in place that are current and they're relevant for you and your business and also for you in your industry.
So from a point of view of keeping things up to date, it seems to me with PPSR, Privacy Act, Craigslist and everything overseas, health and safety, it seems that there is always some change going on, and that you could actually have your terms of trade very, very easily out of date if you haven't looked at them even in the last year. Is that a fair comment? You have to keep reviewing your terms of trade, or you get one set of terms of trade and you're good for a long time?
Correct. So, your terms of trade may not necessarily be an annual review, but they certainly do need to be kept on top of because things do change periodically. And again, where did your terms of trade come from? Who wrote them? So it's always worthwhile having an expert come in and have a look at your terms of trade, just to make sure whether they were written last year or 10 years ago, are they relevant for you and your business and the industry that you're in and the current legislation.
Okay. Because there's nothing sadder than putting the time and effort into making sure they get signed and having someone's lawyer cleverly just drive right through a hole that you have in them. Not only do you have them, you have to know how to apply them, and you have to know they're up to date. So you've got to make sure, it's almost like a first aid kit. There's no point trying to find old Band-Aids. You've got to know exactly what you're doing with your terms of trade, and you've got to have expertise look at them for you. But when all's said and done, that terms of trade is the cornerstone key piece that you've got to have in place.
Correct. So if we talk about the business pyramid of needs, and the fundamental foundation part being safety and security and cash flow, then terms of trade fits the very base. As you said, it's the cornerstone. Without the terms of trade, you don't have the ability to register PPSR. Without the ability with terms of trade, you don't have the privacy legislation, so you may not be able to default list a person. So terms of trade is fundamental to everything that you do in your business and how you interact with your customers. In fact, I talk about terms of trade as being a roadmap to a resolution. So if you are in conflict with your customer, you ultimately have your terms of trade to fall back on, so you know where you stand, they know where they stand, so you come to a faster resolution.
It's the rules of the game.
It's the rules of the game.
And you've got to have rules if you're going to play the game. So how often do we find there's a significant change that means you've got to update those terms?
Yeah, and that could be potentially crystal ball material. It does depend on the industry. There are some major pieces of legislation which are globally impactful. We had the health and safety legislation that came out in 2015, and that affected all businesses and organisations. And the next piece of legislation coming through that's going to be happening is the privacy changes to the New Zealand privacy legislation. So the privacy law in New Zealand is the next biggest change of legislation. So that's a 5-year gap in between legislative changes. However, if I'm in the building industry, it's a more complex industry, and there are pieces of legislation that change periodically, but we deal with those on a case-by-case basis.